I'm an associate fellow here in the Asia program at Chatham House, and I'm here to introduce our contributor today, Lee Jones, from Queen Mary University of London, where Lee is a reader in international politics. His topic is going to be on China's global governance, and in particular the Asian Infrastructure Bank. Before we get started on that, just a couple of housekeeping points. Firstly, a reminder that this event is on the record. And secondly, that there is a chat function in the bottom left of your screen. And please feel free to submit questions for Lee at any time during his presentation, or indeed at the end when we'll be having a question and answer session. And also, if you're experiencing any technical problems as we go through this webinar, please pop them in there as well, and we'll also do our best to resolve them for you. So that's really the context and housekeeping. Onto the meat of the topic. Particularly these days, there's a lot of discussion about China's role in the global rules-based order, to what extent China is a willing participant or a disruptor of that order, and the various initiatives that China has underway to create new institutions or make overseas investments, or indeed work with existing institutions. And perhaps the most noteworthy of these a few years back was the launching of China's first multilateral but Chinese-led institution, the Asian Infrastructure Bank. Lee has been doing some research on that and also placing that in the context of China's overall approach to international development finance. He'll take us through the key messages of that, but just to note that on page 2, there is the list of the articles and public where that you can access the full publications of Lee's work. Over to Lee now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. As Andrew's just said, this is basically a summary of the paper that is in the latest edition of International Affairs. And the argument that we make in that paper, myself and Shahar Hamiri, is that the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, is not a threat to the rules-based international order. It is very similar to existing multilateral development banks. But if we look at the wider field of Chinese international development financing, the AIIB is a bit of a red herring. The AIIB is just one institution among many, and the field of development financing in China is very fragmented and poorly coordinated, and other actors within that field do, and they will continue to challenge existing global norms in development financing. But this will reflect the disorganization and lack of coordination of that development financing field, rather than a strategic intention by the Chinese elite to overthrow existing global governance norms. So, as Andrew was saying, there's a lot of controversy around the AIIB. To begin with, I just want to be clear that I'm talking here about international development financing rather than overseas development assistance. ODA is narrower and meets OECD requirements, for example, not tied, whereas most Chinese aid is tied in some way to exports, which we'll come back to in a moment. So we take a wider view of international development financing. And as you can see from those figures there, Chinese international development financing has really ballooned in recent years to rival that of the United States. And it's often seen as a form of rogue aid. So it's seen as propping up authoritarian governments, undermining democratization, good governance efforts. And the AIIB is seen by some as a challenge to existing donors like the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. And the paper, we say this is just not the case. The reality is that the AIIB is very, very similar to existing multilateral development banks. There are some minor differences. So it's focused on infrastructure. It's commercial, so it wants to make money. So it focuses very much on the repayment capacity of would-be lenders, borrowers rather. Most of the directorships are reserved for Asians. The boards are not resident alongside the bank. And China has a veto on issues requiring a super majority, but that's not in terms of project financing. So these are the differences. But if you look at the similarities, they're identical. The AIIB is identical in all other respects to the other MDBs. The structure, the governance system, the operating procedures, they're all basically identical. And if you look at what the AIIB is actually doing, it now has 20 projects online. 19 of those 20 are co-funded with existing MDBs, like the ADB or the World Bank. And so those projects are actually governed by the rules of those other multilateral development banks. The AIIB is actually a junior partner, and in that sense, it's actually a rule taker. Now, we need to shift our gaze, however, from the AIIB to think about the real challenge that China is posing in the field of international development financing. And here we need to think about the way that the Chinese party state has changed in the last 20, 30 years. And it's become more fragmented, more decentralized, and more internationalized. And there's simply many more actors in this field. It's very fragmented, it's very messy. There are some key ministries involved. Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Commerce, MOFCOM, are the two key kind of rival ministries. Ministry of Foreign Affairs likes to use aid for geopolitical purposes. MOFCOM wants to use it to promote China's commercial goals. And MOFCOM is generally more powerful and wins out in those struggles. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is basically used as a diplomatic fixer. The Ministry of Finance allocates aid budgets but does not set them, and there's many other ministries that have aid budgets concealed within their overall budgets that are not under the control of any particular ministry. Then you've got the state policy banks, the China Development Bank and the Exim Bank, who are the ones that actually provide the vast bulk of the finance in terms of international development financing. Plus the commercial banks, they're often involved too. And some really key actors are state-owned enterprises and provincial governments, because most aid being tied is implemented by state-owned enterprises, often at the provincial level. And they often go out and lobby governments in developing countries to apply for aid so they can get contracts. And these are very poorly regulated state-owned enterprises when they operate abroad. This field is very poorly coordinated. There are coordination mechanisms that exist, but the universal view is that they don't work very well. And there's also very poor regulation, particularly, as I mentioned, over state-owned enterprises operating overseas. And this often leads to many frictions and problems, such as poor environmental and social impact assessments, leading to big backlashes and protests around Chinese development projects. And we can see here a comparison of the World Bank as the kind of premier, if you like, multilateral development bank, and the way that its regulations operate compared to the main Chinese funders of international development financing. Just a quick glance around environmental and social impacts, grievance, monitoring and review, and so on, shows you how weakly regulated Chinese development financing is. Now we can see that the AIIB is actually quite a marginal player when we come to focus on the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the big focus of Chinese foreign policy and overseas development initiatives at the moment. And the AIIB was ostensibly created to implement BRI, but actually is a very marginal player. So on paper, it has $100 billion worth of notional capital, but actually only $18.5 billion have been paid in. And the goal is only to have 20 billion in capital by 2024. In terms of what it's actually investing in at the moment, there are 20 projects coming to 3.5 billion. So already a fifth of its assets have been invested. When we look at what these projects actually are, only 5 of them, so less than a third in value terms, are really Belt and Road in terms of being transnational infrastructure. And the AIIB's stake in these is only 12%. So these are generally co-funded with different multilateral development banks and funders. Now compare this to some of the other actors who are involved. So you take just one investment platform, which is owned by the State Administration of Foreign Exchange, the China Parasol Tree Investment Platform Company. They injected $38 billion to the China Development Bank for BRI projects in 2015 alone. Now, that one infusion is double the AIIB's paid-in capital. The China Development Bank and Export-Import Bank, over $100 billion allocated for BRI projects in 2016, and prospectively over a 2-year period, the CDB put in near $900 billion. Then the commercial banks, between just three of the main commercial banks, they have over $570 billion. CITIC Bank over $100 billion in 1 year alone. So you can see really that the amount of focus that there has been and the controversy around the AIIB is really a red herring. The AIIB it's interesting to know about, it's interesting to know what it's doing and so on, but we mustn't lose sight of the very messy, fragmented governance system around international development financing. The consequences of this system is that Chinese international development financing and the Belt and Road Initiative are not well governed. There is a very loose, fragmented governance system that the Chinese have recognized themselves by trying to introduce a new aid agency to improve coordination. But it remains to be seen whether this agency will do any better than the previous coordinating mechanisms. Likewise, the state-owned enterprises that will mostly be tasked with implementing Chinese development assistance and the Belt and Road Initiative are very poorly regulated. There have been efforts to develop better regulation over state-owned enterprises operating overseas in response to various scandals and diplomatic tensions that have arisen around particular projects. But the reality is that regulation is still weak, general, and quite vague, and state-owned enterprises still get away with an awful lot overseas, and the Chinese government knows this full well. So there is a real possibility here of blowback from Chinese development assistance as it increases around the Belt and Road Initiative. Many of these projects will not be very well thought out. The implementing state-owned enterprises will not be very well regulated, and there is a possibility of really stirring up local tensions where they already exist, playing into local conflicts, and creating bilateral tensions between China and recipient states. The consequence is that we need to think about Belt and Road Initiative not as some kind of grand strategy or a careful blueprint that has been drawn up in Beijing, which will be implemented according to some carefully worked out plan. It is not a grand strategy. It's better seen as a rather chaotic scramble for resources among the different actors in this domain. So to come back to the original question, is the AIIB a challenge to existing global governance norms and the rules-based order? The answer is no. The AIIB is mostly consistent with existing rules-based order, but the practices of these other entities, state-owned enterprises, the development banks, the commercial banks, the ministries and so on, they are not regulated in the same way. They have not embraced international best practice in the same way. And so they will continue to challenge and subvert, undermine existing global governance norms. But I want to emphasize that this is not necessarily their intention. This is not what they are setting out to do. It's not some strategic plan to overturn the existing world order. It happens because these entities are motivated by other considerations, whether that's promoting China's economy or simply the quest for profit. I'll end there and open up to questions.
Thank you very much, Lee, for that very clear overview of China's current outward bound action, both in terms of the financial flows and investments and the institutions, and the distinctions you've made between AIIB as a multilateral institution, very much on global principles, versus some of the Chinese policy banks, and the distinction between international development finance and overseas aid, as we classically understand that in the West. We've had a lot of questions coming through already and encourage you to type in more, and any of you listening who would like to add into that. A lot of them link then to Belt and Road and to the questions of what that is, how that's going to work. So maybe putting a few of those together, Alexander Smotrov asking whether One Belt, One Road or Belt and Road Initiative, as it's also known, can be seen as some kind of threat or not. David Brachet asking about you say that aid or development finance in this way will not challenge global governance by strategic intent. Would you say that is equally true in areas where China has a political and military presence, such as Africa or indeed Central Asia?
I think it's true to say that some, on a kind of case-by-case basis, dispersing particular pots of money for development financing and assistance can be strategic. So the Chinese government may decide, for example, to allocate a certain amount of money to a favored client. For example, I think yesterday it was announced that China would supply $100 million worth of military aid to Cambodia, which is one of its main allies in Southeast Asia. So there will be specific pots of money that are used strategically. But I think at the macro level, in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, it would be wrong to see that as a carefully worked out grand strategy. So this goes beyond this paper to another one that I'm writing with a colleague, Jinghang Zheng at Royal Holloway, where we show that the Belt and Road Initiative has evolved from a very, very loose policy envelope into a very loose, baggy plan, where mostly it's provinces, state-owned enterprises that are injecting their schemes and their ideas for what Belt and Road should look like, and then trying to strike deals with recipient countries. And so what you get in practice is something that's very fragmented and quite bottom-up. And a lot of Chinese development finance is very much recipient driven. So the way it works is a would-be recipient applies to the government in Beijing and says, oh, we'd like money for a dormitory or a stadium or a road or something like that. And it goes through a process in Beijing. And so it is in that sense, because it's bottom up and not top down, there's a lack of clear strategic intent. And that also allows the state-owned enterprises and provincial governments that are supporting them to go in and lobby during that process to try and get the resources that will flow from any approval process. And so when we're thinking about these big macro level initiatives, that's what we have to keep in mind, that it is highly fragmented and very much driven bottom up by these different sorts of actors.
Thank you, Lee. I'd come back to the phrase you used, which I liked, about it being a very baggy plan and lots of room and flexibility within it, which ties in with a number of the questions that came in around the digital Silk Road or digital Belt and Road initiative that people are talking about. I know there's also talk of a polar Belt and Road, the space Belt and Road. Anything these days can be in Belt and Road, but I wonder if you have anything to any thoughts on that, and how narrow the definition again is of what goes within Belt and Road.
I think almost anything, as you say, can be Belt and Road. I mean, even Buddhist monks going and visiting their religious brethren in neighboring countries is considered as part of the Belt and Road now. And this is because Xi Jinping does not have a clear idea of what Belt and Road means. He comes up with a slogan, and then it is left to other agencies within the party state to work out what that means in practice. And because there's a lot of money in the system floating around for this, it becomes in everybody's interest to harness their own agenda to the Belt and Road. So, for example, if you're working in digital services and you're trying to develop the digital economy, you can say, well, we need a digital Belt and Road. Or if you're in the space program, you're trying to find a way to attach your space program to that. Or indeed, if you're a Buddhist monk, you try to think about justifying the Belt and Road as a way to spread Buddhism, for example, and you get money to go and then engage with monks in other countries to make them more hospitable to Chinese investment. That's one of the things that's happened in Myanmar, for example. So that's the way we need to think about this initiative, that it is a very, very loose platform, and anybody can go and read the 2015 Visions and Actions document. It's on the Chinese government website. And you will read that and be really quite staggered by the vagueness and the amount of interpretation that the plan is actually open to. It's very broad brushstrokes. So it's basically open to many different agencies to harness their own interests to. And that's really what's going on. So if you want to know the way it will unfold, it will be threatening to certain interests, but it's not a threat in any geopolitical sense. It's not that Xi Jinping is sitting there in a chair stroking a white cat with his clever plan for world domination. It's a very loose, baggy platform in which lots of different things will happen, and it will be quite chaotic and disorderly at times, I think.
Thank you. Picking up on this theme of chaos that you touched on, or disorderly development, one other question from Joshua Rosenzweig was, do you see AIIB as having potential to play a stronger role in maybe putting some order on this, or is it going to remain pretty much separate and marginal in relation to the other major state policy funding initiatives from the Chinese government?
Yeah, I think it will mostly remain marginal, and that's precisely because of the contradictory interests at stake here. So the AIIB is basically bound by international best practices in terms of project approval and scrutiny and due diligence and all the rest of it. The development banks and the Chinese state-owned enterprises and so on are not, and they would quite like it to remain that way. It allows them. If you look, for example, at the SAFE fund that I mentioned earlier on, the Parasol Tree Fund, they made a decision about where to put that. They put that money in the CDB. They did not put it in the AIIB, and it's precisely because they don't want to be bound by these rules. The AIIB, I think, is really quite marginal in the governance network, and it has no real authority over any of the players. So my guess is it's going to remain quite siloed, and it will do some interesting things, and some Chinese officials will learn how to do multilateral development lending, and maybe over time it gets to be a slightly bigger player. But it has no authority over all these other actors, and is very unlikely to ever acquire that, because there would be a vicious power struggle, and it would probably lose anyway.
Building on this topic of, I guess, transparency, standards, the differences between AIIB and the policy banks, I'd like to pick up on some points which people raised earlier on the questions around the role for the UK, London-Shanghai financial market connection, so the bringing in of private capital, which tends to go with greater transparency. And a comment I made, I you know something on this, or a comment that some of the UK Foreign Office funding is itself not very transparent in China, and maybe that can be improved as well. But something around this topic of transparency and the role for other actors to come in and drive some of these international finance initiatives.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, in the last couple of weeks, the Chinese have basically said that they're open to foreign capital coming in to help fund the Belt and Road Initiative projects. And I think that will be broadly very positive. I mean, one of the reasons why the AIIB did not turn out to be the radical alternative that some people thought it might is precisely because of the engagement of Western states. And coming on board and saying, look, we really want to be part of this, but if you are, the rules have to be these. And I think you can chart the evolution of the AIIB through that process. What the United States and Japan have done by remaining aloof, I think, is frankly idiotic. Engagement really shapes the AIIB. And I think the engagement of Western financiers, insofar as they are governed by certain rules, could be very positive. They obviously have to be very careful and do a lot of due diligence. But if they could bring with them a sort of package of oversight measures, that could help really reduce the risk and the blowback possibilities from some of these projects. So I think on the whole, I would really encourage people to, study these cases very carefully and do your homework. But I think in terms of the social and political and environmental impacts, it would generally be quite a good thing.
Thank you. Asking if there are any more questions, please do type them in. And in the meantime, a question from myself, if I may, around the question of risk. And at the broadest level, how risky do you see this international development finance lending to be, particularly out of the Chinese policy banks? Having had the discussions myself, well, issues, of course, where countries have got into severe problems already, and yet also discussions with banks saying, well, we don't really see much risk there at all. So how do you think about the risk of this to China and to those individual institutions?
The risk is huge. There's huge moral hazard because although the development banks generally are on a commercial footing, so it's quite important to note that they want to make a return on their capital. So they don't necessarily always just hand out cash simply because it's a Belt and Road Initiative project. They do try and do due diligence, and at times they do refuse to fund certain things. But I think there's no doubt that there are many non-performing loans domestically in the Chinese economy, and there's massive surplus capacity in the Chinese economy. And what Belt and Road Initiative is largely about is externalizing that internal surplus capacity crisis. But what that ends up doing is simply shunting it to a different location. So you take Malaysia, for example. There are two big projects that the Chinese are involved in Malaysia, two massive port projects on different sides of the Malay Peninsula. It's not immediately obvious that that those two ports are really needed in such a small territory. and that they're both commercially viable. But because they're being basically pursued by different provinces, two different provinces are involved, and they're associated state-owned enterprises, and their financial backers are involved. What's going on here is a competitive dynamic. And there's no kind of overall oversight in saying, well, hang on a minute, do we really want to be building these two ports, for example? And so what you end up with is a lot of non-viable, non-return generating infrastructure being built. And we can see that with the port in Colombo, for example. And this is being read completely incorrectly as China laying a debt trap for other countries. That what they do is they kind of lend out money, and then the country falls into a debt trap, and then China gets the port so it can send its navy there, as if this is some kind of clever scheme. It's not. It's a reflection of what I've been talking about: poor governance, fragmented, short-termist, and the business plan doesn't work out. You end up building a white elephant. And the Chinese government is forced to step in and take control of the asset to minimize its losses. It's an accidental kind of making the best of a bad situation. It's not a strategic plan. It's far too cynical and inaccurate to read it in that way. So the risks are very high, and the risks are on the recipient side are very high, but also on the financer side.
Thank you very much, Lee. I think with that, we'll draw this webinar to a close. I think what has struck me particularly is your exploration of China as a group of very different independent actors competing with one another, their own objectives, latching on to the recent, the current initiative, whatever is the flavor of the month or the flavor of this year, next year, and whatever. Clearly, China has made great strides in many different areas, but those who see it as a monolithic entity where some order gets issued forth are not really getting beneath the skin of China as a society and economy. And as China goes overseas, it will, as Lee says, indeed encounter many risks and unfamiliar situations. Some things will go well and some things will not go so well. Thank you for your time. Before we leave, I'd just like to put up the last slide, which is to draw your attention to our next webinar coming up on this Thursday, next next week. Grey is the new black, on covert action and implausible deniability, which is a wonderfully worded title, which Dr. Roy McCormack will be giving. So I do encourage you to join into that if you wish to get beneath the skin of that title a little more. And thank you very much for joining today. Goodbye.